Our keynote speaker, literally the person who wrote the book on internships, Ross Perlin. He will speak a little bit about his perspectives on internships, and then we'll have a question and answer period afterwards. And then just with that, I really want to hand it over to Ross. Can you all join me in thanking him for coming?
Just 10 years ago, a gathering like this would have been pretty much unthinkable. To be in a single room with researchers on internships, and there was really nothing like, no such person as a researcher focused on internships 10 years ago, with career services professionals, people working in experiential education, other faculty, interdisciplinary, students, and others, having a serious discussion, both critical and practical, about this major new form of work, which has grown up just in the last few decades, was something that even just 10 years ago was pretty much impossible. So I want to just start by thanking Matt, the Center for Research on College to Workforce Transitions, and the University of Wisconsin, and all of you for coming here and for listening to me during your lunch. It's a little painful to do in this beautiful room while having lunch, but let's try to go back to what the world was actually like in 2009, 10 years ago. We were in the midst of the Great Recession, which had sort of just happened a year earlier and was the kind of deepest economic depression since the Great Depression, and really exacerbated to a new level this phenomenon of unpaid work and this normalization of a culture of unpaid work, which had already been growing for about 3 decades. Internships had transitioned from something that originally were located just in the medical field, kind of in the 19th century, and really just referred to that specific kind of period between medical school and becoming a kind of new, fully fledged doctor, into something that, with the decades, across the course of the 20th century, spread into more and more fields, and then starting in around the 1970s or 80s is how I kind of periodized it with what I called the Internship Explosion, became general across the entire white-collar world, with enormous implications for the future of work and for higher education, and I think for our society in general. And really kind of as ubiquitous as apprenticeships had once been and still are in many ways in the blue-collar world, this notion of the internship had become in the white-collar world. Millions of people were starting to do them by 2009, according to my estimates. And I found no other estimates to go on, so what I did was try to sort of gather the bits and pieces of data and surveys here and there that people had done kind of almost as an afterthought that touched on internships. But it was clear that a majority, a plurality of undergraduates at 4-year colleges were doing at least one internship before they graduated. It was clear that internships were almost entirely unregulated and, as I said, unstudied. That there were massive internship programs, such as the one at Disney World in Florida, which I went and kind of investigated firsthand, where 6,000 to 7,000 interns would be in a given year working at Disney World, a major component of that workforce in all kinds of roles that were virtually indistinguishable from the sort of regular jobs there. Internships were going global. It was something that you could see in just about any corner of the world, any sizable city anyway, in countries, across certainly Europe and Asia, Latin America, even Africa. You started to see internships spreading, and the idea of the internship catching on without even any kind of clear sense of what it meant, but just that this was a prestige term that meant something, and that it was something that people had to have, whatever that meant, some kind of signal, as we can talk about. Internships were even kind of entering the world of government. Capitol Hill was being run by them. Internships were sort of in the news in the White House. There were for-profit companies selling internships and auctioning internships. Most famously, or the highest price that I at least was able to record, was when a one-week internship with Anna Wintour at Vogue was auctioned off for a cool $42,000. Startups were coming along that were, basically saying, you pay us a certain fee and we'll get you an internship with the company of your dreams. And I went and met the people running these startups, and they saw this as a big growth market. And so I think a lot of people at universities and a lot of people who were kind of in the eye of the storm were shocked by the way that this kind of wonderful concept of experiential education, coming out of the experiential education world in many ways, was now kind of going willy-nilly throughout the whole world, and with all kinds of ramifications and effects on social inequality and exacerbating inequality, which was just sort of becoming economic inequality, which was just becoming a sort of major focus of people at that time. So this was the world in 2009, and I'm not going to say that the world has completely changed, but it was around that time I was in the middle of researching what would become my book, Intern Nation: How to Earn Nothing and Learn Little in the Brave New Economy, which the genesis of which was really just a few years earlier, when I had finally myself, of course, taken an internship after resisting it for a while. And when I told my grandparents that I was doing an internship, they said, "Wonderful, you're becoming a doctor, you're finally a success." And when I told my parents, they understood that this didn't necessarily mean I was going to become a doctor and fulfill their dreams, but they at least figured I was going to get paid something because, yeah, they had seen internships around in the 1970s or so, but at that time they resembled sort of paid training programs. And when I said to them, actually, generally these things are not in a lot of fields paid anymore. You just kind of go and hope it's going to work out, and you put in the unpaid time. It was then that I realized that there was a generational story here, that something had changed over the course of just from my grandparents to my parents to me, and that a whole new set of expectations and a whole new culture had grown up, where working unpaid, in some cases for substantial periods of time, doing substantial work, had become completely normal, and not only completely normal, but actually the gateway into much of the white-collar world, and in certain industries, as we know, virtually a requirement, and required also at many colleges and universities, and many programs within many schools. So I thought at the time that I would just be able to find some information about how this had happened, and a kind of summary of where internships had come from and what effects they were having, but it didn't exist. So my ambition became to write what I called at the time the first book-length analysis of internships, a first attempt to take stock of the phenomenon's incredible variety, including the good, the bad, and the ugly, the paid and the unpaid, the ostensibly academic and the completely untethered, part-time internships lasting a few weeks, and ones that are full-time and may last as long as a year, including a focus on interns in their sort of college years, because that's clearly the epicenter of the phenomenon. But what we also started to see, kind of especially around 2009, was a spike in the number of recent graduates and graduate students who felt that they had to take internships, and there were very few entry-level jobs at that point. The entry-level job itself began to become a sort of an endangered species. And you also started to see career change interns. You started to see people later in life, in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, taking internships as well, especially when trying to change careers and needing some kind of trying to find some kind of way in, or some kind of leverage. I focused on the U.S., but I tried to recognize that this was also a phenomenon which was globalizing fast, kind of out of the U.S. In significant ways. I tried to find a definition of this term internship, and I like that one of the focuses here of this gathering is kind of around language, because I think the language of the internship and the word internship is a very important part of its mystique and its kind of spirit. And I wanted to try to at least investigate what it was that drew people to this word, because if you didn't necessarily apply that word to it, if you just said you're going to go help someone for free for a few hours a week for 3 months, people wouldn't necessarily be drawn to it. But it obviously has a power as a word that again signals something. So what I felt at the time was that we needed a view of the entire sort of sprawling system, unsystematic system, and its history, a glimpse of its curious blend of privilege and exploitation. We need to hear from interns themselves, and also from those who proffer internships, the people who sell them, those who work to improve them, and the many who are unable to access them at all. which was really a kind of a silent world at that time, and I think still is kind of underrepresented in these discussions because it's harder to gauge. It's harder to talk about who those people are who don't have access to a system than those who do. But I have to say that writing the book and delving into this gigantic kind of sprawling system, which everybody sort of knew about, but nobody had really kind of wanted to focus on or look at, was in itself a little like being in an internship. I was kind of interning for myself, it turned out, and it's all too easy to sort of exploit yourself, actually, in this kind of economic environment. I had no experience in the art of book writing, and people kept telling me I needed experience. So I faced the classic kind of experience paradox. How do you get experience if you don't have experience? Is there really a book in that? I was asked. My book proposal landed at the bottom of many, many slush piles until connections coming in. A friend of mine happened to meet the editor of a small press at an event and essentially elevator pitched it for me. A coincidence and a connection, and we know the roles that those can play in the world of internships. Even then, I was largely on my own. It sounded impressive, again, as internships often do, but it barely paid. The small book advance was really just enough to kind of go travel, do a little bit of research to actually write the book. I was essentially doing it on spec. And again, that's, I think, a common experience of so many people today, that you have to make the investment up front and hope it pays off in some way. And also that you don't really know what the economic basis, the economic results actually of your activity are going to be. Books, I guess it's kind of becoming less of an open secret now, but or more of an open secret, are really almost a loss leader for many people. The number of books that are actually sold is not how people, make a living and pay the bills. It's much more about reputation building and the opportunities it leads to, and ancillary and auxiliary sorts of things. So I think, again, there's so much opacity about how people actually make a living and how people actually sort of pay their bills. But what I saw was that when the book did touch a nerve, and that this was a universal issue, suddenly a conversation got going and caught fire. And of course, what people wanted were lurid anecdotes. They didn't really want the sober analysis. They didn't really want the nuanced 300 pages. They didn't want the discussions about equity and those who were left out. They wanted to hear about the intern who had carried their boss's urine sample to the doctor. They wanted to hear about the one who had to dress up in sumo wrestler costume to go do a favor for their boss. They wanted the stories, and they wanted the kind of lurid tales of what interns had to do. And of course, the dark side of that is that interns are also sort of figures in classic figures, and they emerged in a big way in pop culture, really kind of starting in the 1990s, but then really through the 2000s, like so many movies, so many shows where interns figure as the sort of the classic people who are kind of at the bottom of the pile, and who may have some promise, but they're sort of the faceless and kind of the people that you can sort of look down on, and that has a very dark side as well. That interns were also subject to sexual harassment, were subject to workplace discrimination, were in a position that, as I said, was kind of simultaneously a mixture of privilege and exploitation, which is sort of it's a difficult thing to sort of try to figure out how those two can be sort of tied together. And what I found was that the demands on me for free labor were actually only intensifying with this book. Media appearances, interviews, advice, business propositions, legal advice, and I think probably many of you have found this as well. I mean, there's actually coming into one's inbox at any given time. There are a lot of asks that are essentially assuming that you must have some kind of other means of subsistence, some other means of livelihood, and that you're going to be able to sort of somehow make the time. And of course, you want to as a human being. But what I found was through just a huge amount of these requests that actually just the world is looking for so much free labor, and you have to kind of you have to sort of find your own threshold, and you have to sort of understand where and how you can give, and and of course you have to find some livelihood that can like hold you through it. So in the past 10 years, I've had now thousands of conversations. I decided in terms of my own trajectory, I had to finish a PhD that I was already embarked on in a totally different field, linguistics. And I'm now co-director of a small nonprofit called the Endangered Language Alliance in New York, where, no surprise, I mean, we have a very small place, but I received probably at least 100 requests to intern over the course of a year. And I want to do it, but I also see that the scale is just, the scale of desire and the scale of available opportunities are just so often at a kind of a mismatch. I also teach as an adjunct professor and as one who is committed to experiential education in the world of linguistics, participatory action and kind of ethnographic research, and very much want to see that mode be fostered in the world independently, if possible, of all of these intense concerns which young people especially feel about entering the world of work. So 2011, the book came out, but also a lot of other things were happening in the sort of the world of internships, and it was a year when the focus on economic equality became more and more intense. And for several years, really a remarkable number of things happened. And I want to just sort of kind of frame my remarks in terms of 5 things that I think have changed in significant ways over the course of these 10 or so years, and 5 things that really haven't changed. I think what happened was for several years there was just a remarkable, and many of you probably saw it being on the front lines, cresting kind of attention and endless news stories and endless discussion of some of these issues that I think has now to some extent receded. But that doesn't mean that the issues have gone away, and that doesn't mean that a lot of promising patient work of the kind we've been discussing here isn't still going on. But I do worry about progress stalling and about this being, something that for media outlets and for many is kind of something, hot to talk about while it's hot, or something seasonal to talk about kind of every May. I don't need to look out the window and see the birds. I can just see the emails coming from journalists who are saying, internship season is here, we're writing a story, and then I know that, summer is coming. It would be better actually if I actually, just opened the window and stepped outside and smelled the roses. But so 5 things that I think have changed in some significant way. One is the legal landscape, which is chock full of detail, and I kind of learned much more about the law than I ever intended to. But the legal landscape is complex, but I argued in my book, and I think it was fairly clear, that a significant number of unpaid internships that were going on in the U.S. and even in other countries as well by their laws were illegal under the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is the fundamental law that protects American workers, which is the fundamental law that led to the end of child labor. I mean, we shouldn't forget that there's a substantial history of child labor in this country going right up to the Fair Labor Standards Act in the 1930s. This is the law that also guarantees paid overtime as well. And, it's the minimum wage. So all of these things that we now take for granted completely, like clean water and clean air, actually are not so ancient and, are rooted in a law that that faced substantial opposition and that had to have certain carve-outs as well, which were particularly kind of those carve-outs left particularly exposed African Americans in the South, and those doing agricultural labor in particular, care workers as well, and other groups that were essentially left out of this bargain, which at least was meant to provide some protections for especially factory workers, I would say at that time. But the legal landscape for internships, how has it changed? Well, having kind of seen that so much of what was going on really was not following the law in any sense, a number of interns started to challenge their employers for not paying them. And the most notable case was around the film Black Swan, which earned over $300 million, and yet had over 100 interns who were working unpaid, doing fundamental work, driving trucks around, managing the set, all these things. And it was very clear on the merits that that these people should have been paid, and they indeed won the lawsuit in terms of on the merits, in terms of getting back pay, but it went through a sort of epic progress through the courts, where at first there was a major victory where a class action lawsuit was allowed that would thus allow all the unpaid interns who were on that, at least over 100, to claim their back wages, rather than having to sort of go individually and each go make their case. So at first, the law as it stood was clearly affirmed, and there was a big victory for the interns in Black Swan, and that then led to, the press around that and just the awareness about that led to what I understand from Alex Fournette, maybe over 50 lawsuits in the ensuing years. I began to lose track of them. I stopped counting around 30, but it was really just amazing how, and itself a kind of education in the world of work, actually, that people were going through. I don't think it's necessarily a good thing for people to have to file lawsuits, but I can tell you from those that I spoke to that this was not, people grubbing for money and sour grapes. This was people who were trying to change a culture and who were saying, you're not going to get a lot of money. You're just going to get back pay, and it's actually probably not worth the time that you have to sort of go through to file the lawsuit in terms of monetary gain. But they were trying to take a stance, and they were sort of understanding and learning about negotiating power, which is a major lesson to be learned in the world of work as well, what the points of leverage are, right? And how one makes a living. But ultimately, the Black Swan case resulted in something kind of ambiguous, because it was appealed and it was fought as a kind of as an important precedent, no longer really about the specific characters, because it was clear enough that those interns needed to be paid and they were going to get paid. But Fox Searchlight, the producer, the production company behind the film, managed to appeal it to a point where you could no longer, the decision was made by 3 judges who were all over 65 and clearly had not interned themselves, that interns were not really a class, a group, that everyone would have to sort of go on their own merits, and that class action lawsuits would not really be certified for interns, and that something called a primary beneficiary test would be the kind of legal test that would be used. And the idea being, is the intern the primary beneficiary of the internship, or the employer, which I think is a highly subjective and problematic sort of test, as opposed to the relatively clear test that had preceded it, which had its own issues, but basically tried to kind of keep internships within the realm of training, vocational training. So the legal landscape has gotten complex, but it has changed. There has been a lot of activity. There has been a lot of awareness. There has been significant legislation at the local level, especially around sexual harassment, where interns had faced a kind of legal limbo for complex reasons that have to do, again, with pay originally. Internationally, significant legislation, especially in Europe and Germany, France, UK, and I think an international perspective is important with regard to internships as well. A second major thing that has changed, I think, and that's in the process of changing, has to do with employer practices, both from the industry association level, where you've had actually industry associations, from public relations to art museums, at least pass resolutions and try to make statements that kind of tamp down on or really try to reestablish standards when it comes to internships, and then you've had a lot of specific employers. I mean, most are not going to announce it, very widely because they don't want to draw attention to past practices. But employers from Condé Nast to Amnesty International, Congress now in some ways, even my own publisher, which formerly had unpaid interns, but as the book came out, switched to paid internships. And I would say don't underestimate, the role of, sort of calling out and issues around hypocrisy, especially I think for organizations that pride themselves on having a social mission. There's often, a lot of attention about some social mission that's out there in the world, but then not as much on the actual basics of what are going on in the office every day and on employment practices. There's been the rise of these sort of Twitter firestorms. I mean, social media even 10 years ago was much less of a factor, where, I understood even, I think a couple of years ago, even the Madison Mallards, the local baseball team here, faced an issue when they advertised for unpaid interns to do substantial work over a substantial period of time. It's very interesting to see how people are organizing on, and, especially young people who are in the internship economy, whether they want to be or not, are sort of organizing even on platforms like Twitter and sort of calling things as they see them that previously would have received, kind of no attention. People are now at least paying attention. And I think that leads to the sort of the third major thing, which I think has changed, which is very significant, has to do with awareness and media. I think significant numbers of people have at least heard now about these issues and thought for a moment about these issues, and the sort of the vast economy of unpaid internships and its wider effects. And there's been something of a rebalancing of the discourse, at least, where up to 2009, I would say that there was a kind of unquestioning eagerness around any opportunities that people could reach for. And I think there have been some changes just in the way people talk about work, and there's still a long way to go, but I think there's a new sharpness to the thinking about work. I think it's something that we can all kind of contribute to, is that the discourse around money and career needs to be rooted in a little bit of skepticism, in the sense of just that you have to navigate. You have to navigate systems that are not necessarily entirely in your favor. They may have things that are in your favor. They may have things that are not. But that also new types of work are being sort of recognized. That some have recognized for some time, but work, emotional labor, care work, other forms of unwaged labor, I think are all being sort of seen more now by more people. Forms of internet labor. And I think, as a fourth, that there's been a new political awareness as well, some degree of organizing now. In Canada, some very notable examples: the Canadian Intern Association and this massive intern movement in Quebec, which is worth looking at. In the U.S., Pay Our Interns by Carlos Vera and Guillermo Creamer, who have led the charge with congressional internships in particular, and I think are now going beyond that. But Capitol Hill for many years stood as this kind of symbol of how, thousands of interns on the Hill, at the very center of the political system, and political campaigns, essentially running off free labor. And it's remarkable now that, so many of the candidates for this presidential election coming up are now, as I understand it, actually paying their interns. And I think that's a significant thing. And probably very closely related to interns, the most significant thing that I could never have seen coming in the last 10 years is the way that the Fight for 15, this set of efforts around raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, have succeeded widely in many parts of the country. And there's a close connection between the issue of minimum wage and the issue of internships. I think, for those who would say that, internships, unpaid internships are a necessary part of the economy, you can, I think, prove through looking at the minimum wage and the fact that the minimum wage has actually only sort of bolstered employment, certainly has not affected negatively employment, that free labor is not is not something that our economy somehow requires. The fifth and last thing that I'll mention that I think has been a very significant development, in some ways represented in this room, is the coming together of a field, a small new field of scholars focused on internship experiences, interacting and working closely with career services professionals and universities, but also, doing really innovative work. Some of the scholars who are here, like Kari Chandra, Alexander Fournette, John Nunley, Matthew Hora, and all of his collaborators here at the University of Wisconsin, people working creatively with new and old data sets, experimental design. Some of these studies we've been hearing about them here, so I won't go into them. But I think they really sort of open up a new horizon for understanding what's going on, where all I could do at that time was just kind of map out the territory as one single person going around and talking to hundreds of interns and talking to employers and others, just kind of going around in rental cars to different intern hubs. Now we're talking about kind of serious, larger scale studies, and also kind of a precision and a kind of focusing in, just from what I've heard, this morning, whether it's the teams, working on HBCU internship situations and views, or research we heard about from Cindy Kilgo and LGBTQ experiences, and just being able, with much more precision, to break down these kind of aggregated and themselves still very kind of partial numbers and stats that we have. So in a word, this upsurge of activity over the last decade, I think, has had a significant impact, but many of the issues that I raised in Intern Nation are still very urgent and unresolved. Unpaid internships in particular are still a barrier to entry across the world of white-collar work, and the transition from school to work is still all too often a free-for-all, where those who don't have connections or who can't pay to play are really locked out of professions, and that has still significant impact on the complexion of those professions and our society in general, and the sort of leadership of our society, such as it is through these significant professions where internships are integral. And at the same time, those who do intern face exploitative practices. And of course, there are many good experiences too. But I think, again, we needed to seek a sort of rebalancing of the discourse. So declarations of the beginning of the end of the unpaid internship were premature, I think. There were such declarations a few years ago. And I think it's not just a matter of a kind of a backlash, but I think it's also a matter of the limits of the movement itself, to the extent that it's been a social movement, and of the thinking around some of these issues. So I think that, even now, 10 years later, where youth unemployment and the economy are in an unquestionably better place, I think, this is a periodic upswing, where a lot of the macro issues are still very much in place. So quickly, here's 5 things that haven't really changed. Contingent work is still the order of the day. This is still, we're still in a world of, and we need to keep this context in mind when we talk about internships, especially we're on a campus, we're thinking about education. We need to still remember that internships have been brought into the world of work, and from the work point of view and in the world of work can be grouped with and thought of together with temps and part-timers and freelancers and permalancers and permatemps and externs and trainees and volunteers on whom there are stricter expectations. Even if each of these things is quite distinct, and even if intern is the kind of prestige term among them that has kind of classier connotations and different demographic connotations, it's still part of the same phenomenon. If anything, I think the so-called gig economy has grown substantially, and we now need to look at how driving Uber and doing Postmates and these kinds of things are also part of this whole world of work, which now in some sectors really dwarfs the sort of old model of work which people still kind of have in their heads and which we still kind of collect statistics by and still organize a lot of society by, which is, permanent job, W-2 with the, stable employer. We're seeing that, we're seeing that the gig economy is now being challenged, most notably through AB 5 in California, which, just passed and is going to require that basically that places like Uber, look at their drivers as, treat their drivers as part of the regular workforce, such that I think the language of the law is that you can only be considered an independent contractor if the work you do is outside the usual course of a company's business. And obviously the drivers for Uber are not outside the usual course of the company's business. The work that goes on in Amazon warehouses is now an emblematic, these are now emblematic forms of contemporary work that are major parts of our economy. Social media work is a category that has grown massively. And indeed, I think, we can't even sort of capture its full scope because the extent to which self-promotion, influencer work, the commodification of your online persona, especially among younger people, these are, sort of constant pressures, and they are essentially a work of self-fashioning that is constantly going on now, and that, may escape our notice. But another thing that really hasn't changed or has only gotten worse is student debt. I think, we're now at, these numbers just sort of dwarf the imagination, but 45 million borrowers collectively owing 1.5 trillion in student loan debt. This is, $28,000, I think, per on average. We're talking about sort of doubling in the last decade, according to the Federal Reserve, the levels of student debt, which is, of course, closely linked to tuition that keeps rising. A third thing, living with parents, is now the major form of residence for adults between the ages of 18 and 34. This is now approximately a third of all people in that age range are living with their parents. And it's part of this much larger story, which, again, internships are part of, and part of what I wanted to show in the book is that, we can't just view internships in isolation. We have to understand the larger social forces. And this kind of phenomenon of extended adolescence and a feeling like you can't really ever grow up, you can't hit those traditional milestones of buying a house, getting married, having kids, that feeling has grown and grown. And this issue of intergenerational inequality is sharper than ever. And I think also that really is the explanation for understanding also, a political divide, which is sharper than ever, where you see younger people, to the extent that they are politically engaged, going towards candidates who speak to this and who try to offer a plan to solve this and to narrow this gap. Another thing that has not changed substantially, I would say, is the stance taken by universities, who are under a lot of pressure, of course, to be more and more vocational. But we have to remember that universities are employers, and in whatever situation, like other employers, will try to defend their interests. And the interest has been substantially, as I've seen it, to be a gatekeeper around these issues. And so, whether that meant filing an amicus brief on behalf of Fox Searchlight, in the Black Swan case, or other forms of lobbying, I think a lot of universities have seen it in their interest to say, no, we kind of own internships. We don't want the government getting involved. To which, I would respond that that cat left the bag a long time ago, and internships are part of the much wider world. And universities can play, I think, a key role as sort of models defining what can be best and most educational in an internship, but to seek to kind of control this form of work, which is now global and diffuse, I think is beyond their capacity. The final point is just that the typical internship has largely remained unchanged, I think, over the past 10 years. And if anything, it comes under new guises and new names: winternships, fellowships of certain kinds, volunteer situations, campus ambassadors. the global kind of concept and spread is still very much with us. If you want to be seen to be doing something about young people and work, you declare an internship program, that's seen to be the thing that you do, but that really should be only the beginning. And in some ways, I think it may be getting worse, where, according to reports, that interns increasingly have to sign non-competing agreements or non-disclosure agreements or forced arbitration agreements, where they're sort of getting the worst side of what it is to be in a contemporary workplace where there are more controls, but not getting any of the good side really. So I want to kind of not paint a too hopeful or too hopeless a picture, I guess. I think I also want to say that to those who are kind of on the front lines of this every day, and especially I think that means career services professionals who, from those that I've talked to, many over the years, are a small number, under-resourced on campuses where there are thousands of students who need this and who see this as one of their primary needs on campus, that you are the largest body of people, the largest organized body of people who can make a difference when it comes to this. You're the people who can bring some of the research that we've been hearing about to bear on actual situations. Just as placing students in jobs, which, was kind of some kind of model for some number of people at one point, just, calling up the local employer and saying, oh, I've got somebody for you, and they get placed. Just as that is not really a viable paradigm, it's not a viable paradigm to just kind of push people to as many internships as are offered. I think we need to have places on campus that are where the career advice and the thinking is both holistic and realistic at the same time, where there are some qualities, and I know this is already there for many, is qualities of a life coach, qualities of a therapist, honesty instead of cheerleading, and where other forms of work, other high impact forms like job shadowing can have their place as well, and where people can learn to leverage this tighter labor market while it's here, negotiate, know their worth, and operate in this complex kind of zone where nothing is what it seems to be. So I want to maybe just close by very briefly saying a few words about language, equity, and quality, which I think are kind of an excellent kind of rubric for this gathering. In terms of language, it's still a mess, I think. I think formalization of defining what an internship is still a worthy goal, and it may be that something can be achieved, something closer to a consensus, but that there's also going to have to be a sort of keeping up with this constant informal semantic shifting sand of around words. And it's the same issue when it comes to other forms of formalized quality control and benchmarks and things like that. This is really a kind of living, breathing, constantly shifting phenomenon, which is not so easily corralled, I think. And indeed, as we've talked about, signaling is kind of, in some ways, at the heart of it. And so this question of, to what extent is the signal still functioning? To what extent can we sort of, put content there and quality there and have it not just be a signal? It's challenging. And this directly connects, the issue of language directly connects to equity, because it's hard to move to equity without things like definitions, numbers, without the Bureau of Labor Statistics paying attention and kind of setting a bar. How do you know if things are equal if nobody really knows exactly what's going on or what we're talking about, what the terms are and what the numbers are? And the studies that are already happening from people in this room that really kind of break down the different dimensions, which are clearly there, from class to race to gender, sexual orientation, geography, those not in college, gender expression, those who have connections and access versus those who don't. And so, it's not just about pay, as many people have said at this gathering, and the fact that this is inextricable from larger issues around equity in the world of work more broadly. I think we kind of miss the extent to which hierarchy, despite our sort of democratic ideals in politics and in other realms, hierarchy is so much a part of our worlds of work still that it affects the world of internships. In terms of quality, I think it's a lot of just hard daily work on the front lines, quality, not quantity, has to be the mantra, and worsening quality can easily go unnoticed, I think, where there's this constant kind of cycling through, especially among those who are doing the internships, are in so many cases, just trying to sort of get through their experience of it, and I think we are the people, those who are paying attention over the years, who are working in this area, who need to find ways to kind of measure these things over time and provide some kind of sense of institutional memory. So more research on student experience, I think more appeals to altruism for those who are in positions of supervision and mentoring as well. We shouldn't just take it for granted that, that we have to kind of find some point of negotiation between an employer's need for, kind of quick help on work versus, the students' need to get experience. But I think an appeal to altruism in some cases can go far. So there's a lot more to say, but I want to leave time for questions. But I wanted to just read briefly one of hundreds of emails that I've received over the years from a young woman. I received this last year about her experience. I just read a couple of pieces about your work trying to get compensation for unpaid interns and just wanted to say thank you. I'm in the midst of my second unpaid federal internship right now, and as much as I love the people I'm with and appreciate the opportunity, it's insane. What is now an unpaid internship used to be paid training at entry-level jobs, thus destroying the idea of entry-level jobs. In my positions, I've helped to solve criminal investigations and am assisting in foreign aid program development, but all my labor is free. As someone new in DC, I feel constantly out of place. My family was wrecked during the recession, and there was a time last year when I was sending my parents money while I was in school. I tried to do everything right and got numerous scholarships, volunteered, kept a 4.0, all while working. I'm now working as a barista the moment I get out of my internship, quite often pulling near 18-hour days, at least 4 days a week. I do schoolwork as well to be able to graduate in 3 years and avoid more loans. However, in this position, I see people who have had their entire families in federal positions. They have these opportunities offered due to established networks, are supported financially the whole time, and avoid mental health deterioration. And because of that, they're able to go to happy hours to form closer bonds as other people go to second jobs. I slept in a van for a month to save up for DC and don't even have the promise of a job at the end of this. I truly wish you the best in pursuing these changes. There have been around 5 times these past 2 months when I almost broke down and went back home so I could spend more time working to help my family. But at these times, I just think about how soon I'll have the experience to be in a place where I can change the system. The moment I get power, I'm going to do everything possible to make sure no interns are living in vans or doing minimum wage jobs just to have an opportunity that others get handed to them. I've had too many brilliant friends who would have been assets turn down opportunities due to no stipend, wherein mediocre yet more economically stable students take their place and are able to rise in the ranks quicker. This is a cheat and a failure of the American dream. I would just add that for a lot of people, the idea of the American dream being a cheat and a failure is not necessarily something new, and for many others, it's always been something misty and vague, a dream, as the name says, and not a reality. Growing numbers of people are feeling and arguing that meritocracy, whatever that means exactly, is not working or has lost its meaning, and internships are part of that discussion. But by taking up the sober exercise of understanding where we are, what's really happening, as people in this room are doing, patiently assembling the research and doing the hard work of designing something better that fits with both our aspirations and realities, we can get somewhere further than where we were 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I went on a search for Intern Nation, and I found it everywhere around me, just overlooked and assumed. Since then, we have come a long way, but we have a long way to go. Thank you.
I wanted to thank Ross for coming and speaking to our meeting about his research and his thoughts about the state of internships now and in the past. When we designed the program for this meeting, we intentionally wanted to feature some of the more promising developments that have been happening in the world of internships. effective strategies for teaching the so-called soft skills, for developing employer relationships, but also some of the darker sides that aren't talked about enough. Barriers to access faced by first-generation low-income students, some of the less promising and less high-quality internship experiences that some students are having. So I just wanted to thank you, Ross, for drawing attention to the both positive and the negative features of internships. But I think some of the darker, negative side of things really cannot be ignored. And with that, I'd like to invite you all to a talk that we're going to have on December 4th in the School of Education. We have invited Jenny Chan from the University of Hong Kong to speak about her new book, Dying for an iPhone. And this is possibly going to be the next book on internships. Jenny's done extensive work in Foxconn in China, and the extensive labor abuses that have been documented time and again. And you keep on hearing news reports, just one came out last month. And so as many of you know, Foxconn has a major, or they may have a major investment in the state of Wisconsin. And so there's a lot of questions. What types of labor practices are they going to be importing into the United States? What types of internship programs will they be developing? And so again, the title of the book, Dying for an iPhone, I think that should be signal enough that there are still considerable concerns about the world of internships that Ross raised over 10 years ago. And so with that, we have time for questions.
My name is Saudi Brown from University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. I have supervised students taking a course that's required within the curriculum that is credit-bearing, meaning they would have a certain criterion of completing so many contact hours at an internship site. In the course syllabus, it has that requirement. And there's some other tasks that they will have to complete for that course. In that case, they're receiving the credit for what they're doing at internship sites. But we've had students who would look for internship sites that would pay. And they would find a employer who would pay for the hours that they would complete as part of the course. And so in that situation, in your opinion, getting paid and then receiving credits, is there any concerns with that model, or no ethical challenge with that, where students receiving credits towards graduation because internship is part of the curriculum they're in, but also getting paid from the employer?
I would say that the idea that the university or the campus is kind of a space above money or outside of money, and that pay somehow, is kind of an unethical or dirty thing in the context of university education, I think that doesn't make any sense. There are, of course, specific situations, conflict of interest kinds of situations. It will depend on the actual employers or the work that's happening. But we have to recognize that on every campus, a substantial number of the students are also workers at the same time, working in many different capacities, not just internships, but all kinds of roles that are helping them pay for their education. I mean, these things are tightly linked. A university campus is not a kind of utopian space away from labor. But that said, this general issue of kind of credit versus pay, as it sometimes is framed, and it used to be kind of commonly said, maybe it still is, well, they're not getting paid, but they're getting credit, to which some would say, yeah, let them eat credit. Can you live on academic credit? And I think, the academic credit system is its own very strange beast, which, if I had another lifetime, I would also kind of try to research that for a few years. It's a very strange kind of currency, and we have to be careful with it and aware of what it's doing, because this, the situation can arise, which I think is much more of an issue of people paying their university to work unpaid for an employer. I mean, that's a very common scenario. Whereas I would say, if they're able to find an internship that pays and that fits the educational experience that's expected in the class, I don't see a conflict of interest. But I think we need to be aware and thinking about exactly the kind of question you raised, because it's an ethically tricky zone. And I think, for universities and colleges, the issues that I think where we need to think about our role and our place in the internship economy are one in sort of how we promote them and what we promote. And I've heard people here also raising these issues: what kinds of employers, what kinds of situations. It can't just be sort of giving, just free rein, right? But at the same time, there has to be a relationship with local employers and national employers, of course. So one issue is the promotion. A second issue is the requirement in many departments or many schools for, that you have to complete an internship or multiple internships to graduate. Again, could be defensible, could be a good idea, might not be. It depends on the situation. And then the third issue has to do with credit and how credit is being deployed and used, and what kind of currency it represents actually, and what the bottom line impact is on interns and their families.
For someone that started in experiential learning many years ago at the University of Texas El Paso, you're the book that my boss gave to me when we were trying to establish an internship program. So, as you mentioned, there's some things that haven't changed over the last 10 years and some that are taking, a new direction. So in your experiences over the years, what do you, I guess, suggest, recommend that students, professors, higher ed professionals can do to change the current system of internships?
In introducing the world of internships to students, they're going to be hearing about them. They're going to have expectations even when they come in now, right? Even in high school, I don't even know what age it first comes in at now, but early. So there are going to be carrying things with them, but I think it's almost a kind of literacy, which I think, an office like yours would be in a position to help provide. How do you sort of parse? How do you read internship postings? How do you read job postings? How do you read company websites? And how do you actually understand what is being asked for? How do you think about it's the flip side of like helping people with their resumes, right? And with their cover letters, helping them really navigate in a savvy and honest and transparent way what the world of work is like. And so, it's to an extent, it's helping them develop the kind of filters to see what a fair situation looks like, and what's reasonable to expect and what's not, what's not reasonable, and to foster critical thinking. As the wider mission of the university is to foster critical thinking around careers and around work. I know that's still at a pretty general level, but there is a very challenging kind of mismatch often between expectations that students will have, that employers will have, ideas about how professions operate that are idealized, and where I think you can play a sort of a key role by being a sort of a practical voice, but also an honest voice.
Could you please further develop your statement when you stated that, because we both looked at each other and said, then who? You stated that really universities don't own or shouldn't assume they own internships. And I kind of wonder if not us, who? Because I understand it's a global, more of a global world. I get that. But doesn't there have to be some sort of ownership or some sort of coordination of this beast called internships?
Yeah, what I meant by that wasn't that universities shouldn't try to play some leadership role in terms of framing what an internship is about, and kind of I don't know ultimately if it can stay in the experiential education framework from which so much of it came, because the kind of practical career aspects of it and the labor market aspects of it have become so prominent. But I think it's something that needs to be that's a multi-stakeholder situation now, that involves governments, that involves industry associations, that involves nonprofits, that involves for-profits, and I think the roles of which have come up here a few times. I think the roles of parents, the roles of students themselves, I think are all now. They all now have to be in the mix, and I understand it's kind of a guiding principle here that there really isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all thing anymore, or there hasn't been for some time, and there probably can't be, and we need to kind of set up kind of beacons, basically, of good practice, and I think I sense that that's a lot of what people here are trying to do. And then we also have to call out bad practice at the same time. So I think universities do have a leadership role to play, and especially those who are working in it full time and who are mentoring and who are there. But I think universities have sought to actually kind of keep it as their domain, and pretend that other things are not really internships or they're not really happening. And I don't think that will fly.
I read your book a while ago, and I'm wondering about if there's been changes in some of the specific venues that you know of. So I know there was like a chapter on congressional interns, and there was a chapter on like the Disney internship. And I'm just wondering if you've seen, I'm trying to think of other ones, I can't really think of them, but have you seen, or do you know of changes in those particular venues? I thought like the arguments you made were really compelling, so I thought, oh, okay, this is good, this is going to get fixed.
There have been some changes, yeah. I haven't looked closely at Disney, but I understood that they did try to take some steps to shrink their footprint or change the way they operate. Congress is a sort of a notable example that Carlos, who's here, is well poised to speak about. If I understand correctly, Carlos can correct me if I'm wrong, that something like $14 million have been appropriated for paid internship positions on the Hill in congressional offices, and that was actually enacted by Congress, which previously actually had a specific kind of loophole for itself to not pay interns. At least kind of got rid of that. I think Pay Our Interns, the group that Carlos is involved in, kind of exposed who was and who wasn't paying. Now the sort of the issue is that, yes, there is this money. This is very new, kind of hot off the press kind of stuff that Carlos can talk about. But so there is money. The issue is it just going to go to the same kind of insiders and nephews of the legislative director or whatever that it went to before? Just because there's money, does it mean that will there be a kind of arms race where people take on also various other unpaid informal things also kind of accrete in Congress as well? But Congress is an area where there has been some substantial changes kind of in progress, in substantial part thanks to the work of Pay Our Interns. Other individual companies that were kind of named there actually in the book have changed their policies. I think they realized that it was relatively cheap to do so. Some of them are, also places that pride themselves on their social mission, kind of as I mentioned before. Places like The Nation, a very kind of politically engaged magazine that I haven't checked recently, but they were one of the places that actually, rare sort of move, announced that they were changing their policy. My own publisher, as I mentioned. So there have been a number of individual cases, including those in the book. But yeah, there are also kind of deeper, more systemic issues that I think are not so easily flipped.
I haven't told you in person, but I consider him to be the father of the paid internship movement in the country. But it ties to universities. I know one of you asked specifically, like, if it's not us universities who does it, I think we have to look at it from an equity perspective. So the co-founder of my organization, he had to drop out of the university because they raised the tuition, but they didn't raise his financial aid. So the reason why I say that is, in the House side, the regulation stated the internship has to be educational. So some offices started saying, you must be enrolled in college to be paid in this internship. But then you have people that are returning, or drop out or take a year off, or, all these people that were not qualifying. So we went back to the offices and the regulators, and they're like, oh no, we meant like the internship has to be educational. So yes, universities do play a role, but it's not the only one because not everyone is enrolled in college. So I think, to agree with you, we need to look at beyond universities. Same with college credit. I applied for the Department of Education. They accepted me. They said it's unpaid, but you have to do college credit. So I talked to the university, and they said, you'd have to pay us $3,800 to do a free unpaid internship in the Department of Post-Secondary Education looking at Pell Grants. So I would have been interning to look at Pell, you get the point. So we really just have to re-examine these things.
Isabel Agassi, I work with the TOPS College Success Program, and I would like to hear a little bit more, you elaborate on that. How can we expand opportunities, because underrepresented students, most of them are part-time students, they have a full-time job, and I have a student that he worked 60 hours, in his regular work to have an internship. Do you have any recommendations? Can you light a little bit more, shed some light on that area? Because otherwise we will be offering paid internships, but is still favoring the people who can, afford not to pay and go full-time to school. Thank you.
This is the central issue around equity. Really is about access for those who can't afford to work unpaid. I'm not a sort of policy design person, but I've been impressed by ideas to kind of model after federal work study and how that works with, I guess, FAFSA as the kind of the qualifier, where there would be federal money for people who are already getting federal work study. Also to do internship experiences, that it shouldn't just be restricted to the current scope of federal work study. And there's already, I think, a very functional infrastructure there, which allows a lot of local flexibility on campus for those who are in financial aid offices, but also, I think, should, and probably does already, but should involve career offices as well in kind of administering those opportunities. I think that there needs to be, part of why I kind of paint this very broad picture is that I think there needs to be a sort of suite of responses, including policies aimed at student debt issues, including sort of college for all policies, where some of the candidates now for the next election are talking about how at least public colleges tuition needs to be free or much lower where it isn't, so I think there needs to be almost kind of like a New Deal for the young, and it needs to be like a suite of policies that probably would only come about through a political upswell, where a candidate really decides that they actually want to represent younger people partly and really do something for them. So I praise all the measures that can happen sort of in the meantime at a local level, where whether it's an office or a college or a university being able to find some funding to support a certain number of students, I think that those can go far, and I praise organizations. I talk about some of them in my book that specifically are focused on on diversity in different professions and internships as a way into that. So there's a lot of good things going on, measures here and there, but as kind of grand as it sounds, I think a wider system-wide solution is what ultimately is necessary.
Thank you, Ross, for your generosity to the entire field. I don't know of many books that impacted a practice as much as your book has with internships. There are probably other examples, but I can't think of any right now. So thank you for your generosity. So I had a lighter question, maybe to finish this up, which is, I know you had a direct impact on the Black Swan lawsuit happening, just due to your words influencing at least one of those people. Were you surprised by the impact that your book has had, that this has had in terms of the lawsuits and the public awareness about unpaid internships?
There's a chapter of the book actually called "A Lawsuit Waiting to Happen," and then it happened, and my view of the role of a writer who has a foot in the academic world but also a foot in the journalistic world. My view of that role is that you need to be out there. You need to be practical. You need to be actually talking to interns, to career services professionals, to professors, to employers, and trying to and trying to have a direct impact that actually kind of that moves the dial. So I was surprised that nothing had come along before, and I think if my work hadn't come along, other work would have come along, other things where people were already, when I started talking to people, I started finding people who were like, yeah, I've started thinking about that, and people were just sort of looking for a point of entry, and I think what I tried to provide was a point of entry, and I feel like I will have done my own job if actually I can step back and say, actually, there's 150 people in Madison who are on it, and they're doing it, and I came here to kind of meet you guys and to see and to hear about that work, and so I feel like something is now going. There is momentum. There are many different voices and perspectives, and it has some of the qualities of a field and of a movement and of a community of practice. It's gonna evolve in all the different ways that it evolves through all the different vicissitudes of time. But I think it does fill me with some hope to see that that there are so many people who understand that the school to work transition is one of the crucial kind of pain points or zones of kind of conflict and vulnerability in our society. That intergenerational inequality is a major issue of our time, and that's not a hopeless. This is not a hopeless sort of throw up your hands or don't even notice the problem kind of thing. It's a matter of gathering the information, gathering the data, thinking through the problems, and setting to work.